The moment your own daughter starts smiling in court, you learn more about her than you did in the previous 40 years. That was the thought that crossed my mind as I sat alone at the plaintiff's table inside a Charleston probate courtroom on a humid Tuesday morning. My name is Margaret Dawson. I was 72 years old, a widow, a retired school principal, and until that day, I still believed there were some lines family would never cross. The courtroom itself looked ordinary enough. Polished wooden benches, tall windows overlooking the historic district, quiet conversations between attorneys, the soft rustle of legal files being opened and closed. Yet the atmosphere felt heavier than it should have. Perhaps it was because my daughter sat only 20 feet away, avoiding my eyes. Or perhaps it was because I already knew this hearing was never really about legal documents. It was about control. Rebecca Dawson had always been intelligent. Even as a child, she could walk into a room and immediately understand what everyone wanted. As an adult, that ability became something sharper, more useful, more dangerous. Across the room, she sat beside her husband Daniel Brooks, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her posture perfect, her expression calm. Then the judge asked a routine procedural question, and Rebecca smiled. It was not a joyful smile. It was not a nervous smile. It was the smile of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. That was what unsettled me. Because my late husband Thomas had spent 40 years as an attorney, and one lesson he repeated more than any other was simple. Nobody smiles that way unless they think they already know how the story ends. The hearing continued. Lawyers reviewed estate records. Financial summaries were discussed. Property valuations were referenced. Everything sounded technical and dull to anyone sitting in the gallery. Yet beneath every sentence lurked the same issue. Rebecca wanted authority over assets Thomas had spent a lifetime building. She insisted she was protecting the family's future. I wanted to believe her. For months, I had tried to believe her. But belief becomes difficult when every conversation ends with another request to sign something, another suggestion to step aside, another reminder that perhaps I should let younger people take control. As I listened to the proceedings, I found myself studying Rebecca instead of the documents. She barely looked concerned. Daniel occasionally whispered something to her, and she would nod without taking her eyes off the front of the room. They seemed comfortable, too comfortable. Then something strange happened. A clerk entered through a side door carrying a large envelope. At the time, it seemed insignificant. The judge did not react. The attorneys did not react. Most people in the courtroom never even noticed. Yet I did. Years of working in education taught me to pay attention to interruptions. Sometimes the smallest disruption changes everything. The clerk handed the envelope to a court administrator and quietly left. The hearing continued as though nothing had happened. Rebecca remained relaxed. She even exchanged a brief smile with Daniel. Watching them, I felt a chill I could not explain. Not because I knew what was inside the envelope. I did not. Not because I understood what was about to happen. I did not. But because for the first time since Thomas died 18 months earlier, I had the unmistakable feeling that somebody in that courtroom was about to discover they had celebrated too soon. When the hearing adjourned for the day, nobody mentioned the envelope. The attorneys gathered their files. Court staff moved efficiently between tables. Observers drifted toward the exits. To everyone else, it appeared to be just another procedural interruption. Yet the image stayed with me during the entire drive home through Charleston's historic streets. Rebecca and Daniel left the courthouse together. As I walked toward my car, I noticed them standing near the entrance talking quietly. Rebecca looked relaxed. Daniel looked relieved. Whatever concerns they may have carried into that courtroom seemed to have disappeared. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. 18 months earlier, after Thomas passed away, things had been very different. Rebecca had cried at the funeral. She had held my hand. She had promised we would get through everything together. At first, she called almost every day. She checked on me constantly. She offered help with groceries, appointments, and paperwork. Looking back, I could not pinpoint the exact moment when concern became something else. The change happened gradually, almost invisibly. Conversations shifted. Questions became suggestions. Suggestions became recommendations. Recommendations became expectations. Before long, every discussion somehow returned to the same subjects. The estate, the properties, the accounts, the future. One rainy afternoon several months after Thomas died, Rebecca arrived carrying a folder. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and explained that organizing everything sooner rather than later would reduce complications. Her reasoning sounded sensible. She always sounded sensible. That was one of Rebecca's greatest strengths. She never demanded. She persuaded, at least in the beginning. Over time, the requests became more frequent. Documents appeared. Meetings were scheduled. Advisors were introduced. Whenever I hesitated, Rebecca responded with patience. Whenever I asked questions, she already seemed to have answers prepared. At first, I interpreted that as responsibility. Later, I started wondering if it was preparation. The memory followed me into my house that evening. I stood in the foyer looking at a framed photograph of Thomas. It had been taken 10 years earlier on a family vacation along the South Carolina coast. He was smiling beside Rebecca. They had always been close. In fact, there was a period when I believed she understood him better than anyone else in the family. That was what made the current situation so painful. Not the legal dispute. Not the paperwork. The distance. The feeling that every conversation now carried an agenda hidden beneath the surface. The next morning, I received a call from Rebecca. Her tone was cheerful, almost unusually cheerful. She wanted to discuss a few administrative matters before the next hearing. As she spoke, I found myself listening more carefully than usual. There was confidence in her voice. Not hope, not optimism. Confidence. The kind of confidence people have when they believe they already know the outcome. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in Thomas's old study. The room still smelled faintly of leather-bound books and cedar shelves. My eyes drifted toward a cabinet in the corner where he kept records nobody else ever touched. For years, he treated that cabinet like a private archive. Suddenly, I remembered something he once told me during a conversation about legal disputes. He said the most dangerous assumption in any case was believing you already possessed all the facts. As I looked toward that cabinet, I realized something. Rebecca seemed convinced the story was finished. I was beginning to suspect it had not even reached the most important chapter yet. The following afternoon, I unlocked the cabinet Thomas had guarded so carefully throughout our marriage. It stood in the corner of his study beneath a row of law books that had not moved in years. I expected to find organized records, perhaps old case notes or financial statements. Instead, I found something stranger. Nearly every folder was labeled by year, but several carried handwritten notes in Thomas's unmistakable script. One label simply read, "Review before signing." Another said, "Assumptions create mistakes." The phrases felt less like filing instructions and more like warnings. I spent the next several hours sorting through documents while rain tapped softly against the windows. Most of the contents appeared routine. Tax records, property evaluations, insurance documents. Then I found a thin folder tucked behind a row of estate planning files. The folder contained correspondence between Thomas and various advisors during the final 2 years of his life. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed a recurring theme. Thomas repeatedly asked questions about verification. Verification of ownership records. Verification of amendments. Verification of supporting documents. The same word appeared again and again. Verification. As evening approached, my phone rang. Rebecca. The moment I answered, she launched into another discussion about streamlining the estate process. According to her, several upcoming deadlines required prompt decisions. She spoke confidently, almost mechanically, as though she had delivered the same speech many times before. I listened quietly until she finally paused. Then I asked a simple question. "Why are you in such a hurry?" Silence followed. Only a few seconds, but long enough for me to notice. Rebecca quickly recovered and explained that delays benefited nobody. Her answer sounded reasonable, yet something about the hesitation bothered me. After we ended the call, I returned to the folder. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. Thomas was not documenting completed actions. He was documenting concerns. Questions remained unanswered. Reviews remained unfinished. Certain records appeared to require additional confirmation. The next morning, I carried several copies to a small cafe near Charleston Harbor where I was meeting Eleanor Price. Eleanor had retired from the bench years earlier, but she remained one of the sharpest legal minds I had ever known. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the material. She said very little at first. Then she leaned back and folded her hands. "These notes do not read like a man who believed everything was settled," she said. That observation echoed my own growing suspicion. For months, Rebecca had acted as though the future had already been decided. Yet Thomas's records suggested the exact opposite. Eleanor pointed toward one particular memorandum dated 6 months before Thomas passed away. "Look here," she said. A paragraph had been underlined twice. The wording was brief but unmistakable. "Any transfer dependent upon incomplete supporting documentation should remain under review until verification is complete." I read the sentence 3 times. Then a fourth. Something shifted inside me. For the first time, I stopped viewing the situation as a family disagreement. This was becoming an investigation. As I left the cafe, Charleston's waterfront looked unchanged. Tourists wandered the sidewalks. Boats moved slowly through the harbor. Life continued as normal. Yet I could not shake the feeling that somewhere inside Thomas's records was the reason Rebecca seemed so certain she would win. And if I found that reason, I might finally understand what my daughter was trying so desperately to keep moving forward. 3 days later, I experienced the first moment that truly made me question how far Rebecca was willing to go. It happened during a family gathering at my niece's house on Sullivan's Island. The event was supposed to be simple. A birthday dinner, good food, familiar faces, an evening away from legal discussions. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. People laughed. Children played in the backyard. Old stories were shared around the dining table. Then someone casually asked how the estate situation was progressing. The conversation shifted immediately. Before I could answer, Rebecca stepped in. At first, her comments sounded harmless. She spoke about responsibility, planning, long-term stability. Then she began describing how difficult it had become to move forward because certain people were resistant to change. Several relatives glanced toward me. Rebecca smiled politely and continued. She never raised her voice. She never sounded angry. That was what made it so effective. She presented her version of events as though she were explaining a practical problem rather than criticizing her own mother. According to Rebecca, I was struggling to adapt. According to Rebecca, I was allowing emotions to interfere with important decisions. According to Rebecca, delays were creating unnecessary complications for everyone involved. I sat quietly for several moments, listening as relatives nodded sympathetically. Then came the sentence I still remember word for word. Rebecca looked around the table and said, "Sometimes the hardest part is accepting when someone is no longer capable of managing things the way they used to." The room fell silent. No one spoke. No one challenged her. In that moment, I felt something far worse than anger. Humiliation. Not because strangers were judging me. Because my own daughter had chosen a family gathering to question my judgment and competence. Daniel sat beside her and said nothing. His silence spoke loudly enough. I looked directly at Rebecca. For a brief second, I saw uncertainty flash across her face. Perhaps she expected me to argue. Perhaps she expected me to become emotional. Instead, I smiled. A small smile. Calm and controlled. Then I asked a simple question. "Rebecca, can you tell everyone which specific decision I have mishandled?" The silence returned. This time it lasted longer. Rebecca opened her mouth, but no answer came immediately. She eventually shifted the conversation toward general concerns and future planning. The moment passed, but the damage remained. Later that evening, after returning home, I sat alone in Thomas's study thinking about what had happened. The legal dispute suddenly felt different. This was no longer about paperwork. Rebecca was actively building a narrative in which she appeared responsible and reasonable while I appeared incapable. The realization unsettled me deeply. The next morning, I called Eleanor and described the conversation. She listened carefully before asking one question. "Why would someone work so hard to convince others you cannot manage your affairs?" I already knew the answer. Because if people accepted that story, they would stop questioning the decisions being made on my behalf. After ending the call, I returned to Thomas's files with renewed determination. Somewhere inside those records was the truth. And after what happened at that dinner table, finding it was no longer just about protecting an estate. It was about protecting my own voice before someone else succeeded in taking it away. The humiliation at that family dinner stayed with me far longer than I expected. Not because Rebecca had embarrassed me in front of relatives. I had spent decades as a school principal. Public criticism was nothing new. What unsettled me was how prepared she seemed. Her words had not sounded spontaneous. They sounded rehearsed. Over the next week, I paid closer attention to every interaction. The more I observed, the more I noticed subtle patterns. Rebecca was speaking with relatives individually. She was checking in with family friends. She was presenting herself as the patient daughter carrying a difficult burden. Meanwhile, I was slowly becoming the aging widow who could no longer be trusted to make important decisions. The realization was painful, but it also clarified something. Rebecca was not simply trying to win a legal dispute. She was trying to control the narrative surrounding it. A few days later, Eleanor invited me to lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking Charleston Harbor. After listening to my concerns, she asked if I had examined Thomas's personal correspondence from his final year. I admitted that I had focused mostly on financial records and legal documents. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. People hide their intentions in paperwork, she said. They reveal their concerns in letters. That afternoon, I returned to the study and began searching through another cabinet. Near the back, behind several tax folders, I found a narrow storage box containing dozens of envelopes. Most were routine. Holiday cards, thank you notes, business correspondence. Then I discovered a series of letters exchanged between Thomas and a longtime advisor named Richard Bennett. The letters immediately caught my attention because Thomas had underlined certain passages in red ink. One sentence appeared repeatedly throughout their correspondence. Protect the review process. The phrase surfaced again and again, sometimes in passing, sometimes as the central topic of discussion. I continued reading until sunset. The letters painted a picture very different from the one Rebecca was presenting. Thomas was not rushing decisions. He was slowing them down. He repeatedly expressed concern about making major transfers before all supporting information had been confirmed. Several times he mentioned pressure from outside sources. Unfortunately, he never identified those sources directly. Even so, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The following evening, Rebecca called unexpectedly. Her voice was warm and friendly. She asked how I was doing. She asked whether I needed anything. Then, almost casually, she mentioned an upcoming meeting regarding estate administration. According to her, it would be beneficial if everyone arrived prepared to move forward efficiently. The phrase immediately stood out. Move forward efficiently. It sounded remarkably similar to language I had heard from her before. Different words. Same objective. End the discussion. Finalize the process. Stop asking questions. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in Thomas's study holding one of the letters. My eyes settled on a paragraph he had highlighted years earlier. The final sentence sent a chill through me. It read, "The greatest risk is not making the wrong decision. The greatest risk is allowing someone to convince you there is no need to verify the right one." I read the line 3 times. Then I looked around the room at the stacks of documents surrounding me. For months, Rebecca had acted as though every important question already had an answer. Yet the deeper I dug into Thomas's records, the more unanswered questions I found. And for the first time, I began to suspect that someone in my family was far more afraid of verification than they were of the truth. The breakthrough came from a place I almost ignored. Several days after discovering Thomas's letters, I returned to the storage box and noticed a smaller envelope wedged beneath the correspondence. It was addressed to Richard Bennett but had never been mailed. The seal remained intact. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Opening a private letter felt wrong. Yet Thomas had been gone for 18 months, and every clue seemed to point toward questions he desperately wanted answered. Eventually, I opened it. The letter was only 2 pages long, but by the time I finished reading it, my entire understanding of the situation had changed. Thomas described growing concern about decisions being pushed forward before certain reviews were complete. He did not accuse anyone directly. Instead, he wrote about pressure. Repeated pressure. He mentioned conversations that left him uneasy. He mentioned requests for faster timelines. Most importantly, he mentioned concerns about financial motivations influencing family decisions. My heart began beating faster. Until that moment, I had viewed Rebecca as the primary force behind everything. But the letter introduced another possibility. Thomas referenced someone facing substantial financial obligations. Someone who appeared increasingly focused on future transfers and asset access. The description did not sound like Rebecca. It sounded much more like Daniel. That realization stayed with me throughout the day. Later that afternoon, I met Eleanor again. Together, we reviewed the letter line by line. She said very little while reading. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. "I think you have been looking at the wrong person," she said quietly. The statement surprised me. Rebecca was the one making phone calls. Rebecca was the one pushing meetings. Rebecca was the one controlling the narrative. Eleanor nodded as if she expected my reaction. Perhaps, she said. But influence and motivation are not always the same thing. That evening, I found myself thinking back over dozens of interactions. Rebecca often led conversations. Yet Daniel was almost always present. Listening, watching, rarely speaking. At the time, I interpreted his silence as disinterest. Now I wondered whether it served another purpose. The following week provided an unexpected answer. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that one of Daniel's investment projects had encountered serious difficulties. The information was not secret. It was simply not widely discussed. Delays, financing issues, mounting obligations. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous, but enough to create significant pressure. Suddenly, several pieces of the puzzle began fitting together. The urgency, the confidence, the constant desire to accelerate decisions. If Daniel needed stability quickly, access to future resources would become far more important. For the first time, I began to see Rebecca differently. Not as an independent architect of the entire situation, but as someone who may have convinced herself she was helping solve a problem. That did not excuse her behavior. It did not erase the humiliation she caused. Yet it complicated the story. Real life often does. 2 nights later, Rebecca called again. Her tone was unusually upbeat. She mentioned plans for a family dinner the following weekend and spoke as though the legal matter was already approaching a favorable conclusion. As I listened, I realized something unsettling. Rebecca sounded relieved. Not because questions were being answered, because she believed the questions were about to disappear. After ending the call, I sat alone in Thomas's study and reread the unopened letter one more time. Near the bottom, he had written a sentence that seemed directed toward the future. Never confuse confidence with proof. As I placed the letter back into its envelope, I understood that someone in my family had done exactly that. And sooner or later, the difference would matter. The family dinner Rebecca mentioned took place the following Saturday evening at a waterfront restaurant overlooking Charleston Harbor. By the time I arrived, Rebecca and Daniel were already there, seated near a window with a view of the marina. Their mood immediately caught my attention. They seemed lighter than they had in months. Relaxed, confident, almost celebratory. Several other relatives joined us, and for a while the conversation remained harmless. Vacation plans, local events, stories about grandchildren. Yet beneath the laughter, I sensed the same current running through every recent interaction. Anticipation, as though something important was approaching and only a few people knew about it. During dinner, Daniel spoke more than usual. In fact, it was the most animated I had ever seen him. He discussed future opportunities, upcoming projects, and exciting possibilities waiting just around the corner. Rebecca listened with a smile that never seemed to leave her face. Several times, they exchanged glances that suggested private understanding. Not secretive. Certain. The distinction mattered. They were no longer hoping for a favorable outcome. They were behaving as though it had already arrived. At one point, a relative asked whether the estate matter would finally be resolved soon. Rebecca answered before anyone else could speak. "I think everything is moving exactly where it needs to go," she said. The confidence in her voice was unmistakable. I looked at Daniel. He nodded almost immediately. That small gesture told me more than either of them realized. Later that evening, after returning home, I found myself unable to stop thinking about the conversation. If Daniel's financial pressures were truly significant, then certainty would be comforting. Dangerous, but comforting. I walked into Thomas's study and began reviewing the files once again. Not because I expected a breakthrough, simply because something still felt incomplete. Near midnight, I discovered a reference I had overlooked before. It appeared in a memorandum attached to one of Thomas's review notes. The memorandum referenced supporting documentation that should have accompanied a key estate authorization. According to the note, the supporting material was essential for final validation. Yet the referenced attachment was nowhere to be found. I searched through multiple folders. Nothing. I checked storage boxes. Nothing. The attachment seemed to have vanished. The following morning, I brought the memorandum to Eleanor. She studied it carefully before looking up. If this attachment existed, it would have been important, she said. Important enough to change things? I asked. Eleanor paused. Potentially. That single word stayed with me for the rest of the day. Potentially. By now, I had learned that small details often mattered more than dramatic discoveries. Missing pages, incomplete reviews, unanswered questions. Each one seemed insignificant until viewed as part of a larger pattern. As the next court date approached, Rebecca's confidence continued growing. Her messages became more upbeat. Her conversations became more optimistic. Meanwhile, I found myself moving in the opposite direction. Not toward certainty, but toward curiosity. Because the deeper I dug into Thomas's records, the more impossible it became to believe the entire story had already been told. Somewhere between the missing attachment, the unfinished reviews, and the confidence radiating from my daughter and her husband, there was still a piece of the puzzle nobody had found. And for reasons I could not yet explain, I had the growing feeling that peace was already on its way toward us. The week before the next hearing felt strangely calm. Almost too calm. Rebecca stopped calling as often. Daniel seemed to disappear entirely. Even the attorneys involved in the case communicated less frequently than before. On the surface, it looked as though everything was settling into place. Yet the missing attachment continued bothering me. Every time I reviewed Thomas's notes, I returned to the same reference. The supporting document existed. Thomas had acknowledged it. The memorandum cited it. Yet somehow it was absent from every file we could locate. 2 days before the hearing, Eleanor called unexpectedly. Her voice carried an energy I had not heard in months. "I think we found something," she said. Less than an hour later, I was sitting across from her in her office. On the desk between us sat a photocopy of a shipping receipt dated nearly 2 years earlier. The document itself was not important. What mattered was what it referenced. A records transfer package. The package had been delivered to an archive service used by several legal firms throughout South Carolina. Neither of us had encountered the reference before. Eleanor explained that one of Thomas's old associates remembered helping organize materials shortly before Thomas became seriously ill. Most of the records were retrieved after his death. Most. Not all. A small collection remained archived because nobody realized it existed. My pulse quickened. "Can we access it?" I asked. Eleanor nodded. "The request has already been submitted." For the first time in months, I felt genuine hope. Not certainty. Hope. The following day moved painfully slowly. Every hour seemed longer than the one before it. Meanwhile, Rebecca appeared more confident than ever. She sent a message confirming hearing details and added a short note about finally bringing closure to a difficult chapter. Closure. The word lingered in my mind. It sounded less like a wish and more like an expectation. That evening, I sat alone on my back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the Charleston skyline. I thought about Thomas. I thought about the years we spent building a life together. Most of all, I thought about how carefully he documented everything. Thomas was many things, but careless was never one of them. If he believed a supporting document mattered, then it mattered. The next morning, the phone rang just after 8 o'clock. "Eleanor." I answered immediately. Before I could say a word, she spoke. The archive located the file. My heart nearly stopped. "What was in it?" I asked. Several seconds passed. Then Eleanor gave an answer that changed everything. The missing attachment was there. And Margaret, it is not what we expected. A chill ran through me. Eleanor explained that the document directly addressed the verification concerns Thomas repeatedly raised before his death. More importantly, it contained information that had never been presented during the probate process. Information capable of changing how several key decisions were interpreted. I closed my eyes and listened carefully. Months of confusion suddenly felt connected by an invisible thread. The unanswered questions, the pressure, the confidence, the missing records. For the first time, the puzzle seemed complete. Yet one detail remained. The hearing was scheduled for the following morning. And as I sat there listening to Eleanor describe the contents of the recovered file, I realized something extraordinary. While Rebecca and Daniel believed they were approaching the moment that would confirm their victory, a package of forgotten records was already making its way toward the courthouse. The morning of the hearing arrived with clear skies and an uneasy stillness that seemed to settle over Charleston. I woke before sunrise and spent nearly an hour sitting in Thomas's study, staring at the recovered documents spread across his desk. Eleanor had delivered copies the previous evening, and I had read them repeatedly until well past midnight. The missing attachment did not contain dramatic accusations or shocking revelations. Its power came from something much simpler. It documented concerns that should have triggered additional review before several critical assumptions were accepted as fact. More importantly, It confirmed that Thomas never intended certain decisions to move forward without verification. The distinction seemed small. In reality, it changed everything. By the time I arrived at the courthouse, Rebecca and Daniel were already there. They stood together near the entrance, speaking with their attorney. Both appeared remarkably relaxed. Rebecca even laughed at something Daniel said. Watching them, I was reminded of the dinner by the harbor. The confidence was still there. If anything, it seemed stronger. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt familiar. Lawyers arranged files. Court staff prepared documents. Observers filled several rows near the back. I took my seat and glanced across the room. Rebecca looked directly at me and offered a polite smile. The same smile I had seen before. Calm, certain, untroubled. For a moment, I wondered whether she truly believed everything was settled or whether she simply needed to believe it. The hearing began with routine matters. Procedural updates, administrative summaries, references to filings already submitted. Nothing unexpected. Nearly 40 minutes passed without any mention of the recovered archive records. Rebecca remained composed. Daniel appeared increasingly comfortable. Then the judge asked whether there were any additional materials requiring consideration before final review. Eleanor rose from her seat. The movement immediately changed the atmosphere. Several people looked up. Attorneys reached for notebooks. Rebecca's expression remained unchanged, but I noticed Daniel straightened slightly in his chair. Eleanor calmly explained that previously archived records had recently been located and that portions of those records directly related to verification procedures referenced throughout Thomas's estate planning process. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. The judge requested copies. Court staff began distributing documents. For the first time that morning, I saw uncertainty flicker across Rebecca's face. It lasted only a second. Then it disappeared, yet I knew I had seen it. As the judge reviewed the material, Eleanor carefully explained the significance of the missing attachment. She highlighted language requiring additional confirmation before specific assumptions could be treated as final. She referenced memoranda already included in the official record. One document connected to another, then another. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The recovered attachment did not stand alone. It completed a chain that had been missing for nearly 2 years. Across the room, Daniel's confidence appeared to be fading. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something urgently. Rebecca no longer smiled. Instead, she watched the proceedings with intense concentration. The certainty that had surrounded them for months seemed to be slipping away one document at a time. As I sat quietly listening, I realized we had finally reached the moment Thomas had anticipated. Not a dramatic confrontation, not an emotional argument, simply the arrival of information that should have been present all along. And as the judge turned another page from the recovered file, it became increasingly clear that the story everyone thought they understood was about to change. What happened next unfolded far more slowly than anyone in the courtroom expected. There was no dramatic outburst, no sudden declaration. Instead, the judge continued reading through the recovered records while attorneys quietly reviewed the same pages. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Every minute that passed seemed to erode a little more of the certainty Rebecca and Daniel had carried into the hearing. Eleanor remained calm as she guided the court through the timeline Thomas had documented. One memorandum referenced another. A review note connected to a supporting attachment. An attachment connected to correspondence that had never been considered during earlier proceedings. Piece by piece, the missing sections filled gaps that nobody realized existed. The most important discovery was not a hidden asset or a forgotten account. It was evidence that Thomas intentionally required additional verification before several recommendations could be treated as completed decisions. The distinction sounded technical. In reality, it affected nearly every assumption surrounding the case. The judge eventually looked up from the documents and asked a simple question. Had the verification process referenced in the recovered records ever been completed? For several moments, nobody answered. Attorneys shuffled papers. Notes were reviewed. Dates were checked. Finally, one of the legal representatives acknowledged that the court record contained no evidence showing the final verification requirements had been satisfied. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Across from me, Rebecca's expression changed for the first time since the hearing began. The confidence was gone, not replaced by panic, replaced by uncertainty. She looked toward Daniel. Daniel looked toward his attorney. Neither appeared prepared for what they were hearing. As additional documents were examined, another pattern emerged. Thomas had repeatedly delayed certain recommendations until supporting information could be confirmed independently. He had not opposed future transfers. He had not rejected planning efforts. He simply insisted on verification before conclusions were reached. That principle appeared throughout nearly every recovered record. Sitting there, I suddenly understood why Thomas had preserved so many notes. He was not creating obstacles. He was creating safeguards. The realization hit me harder than I expected. For months, I had wondered whether I was imagining problems where none existed, whether grief had made me suspicious, whether Rebecca was right, and I was simply struggling to let go. Now the documents were answering those questions for me. The issue was never resistance to change. The issue was whether the process had been completed correctly. The judge requested a short recess while the newly recovered records were reviewed in greater detail. As people stood and moved around the courtroom, I remained seated. Rebecca and Daniel spoke quietly with their attorney near the opposite side of the room. Their conversation appeared urgent. Several times Daniel glanced toward the stack of documents resting on the clerk's desk. For months, they had been moving steadily toward an outcome they believed was inevitable. Now that outcome no longer seemed guaranteed. Eleanor returned to my side and placed a hand gently on my shoulder. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing, she said softly. I looked at the recovered records spread across the table. The notes, the letters, the missing attachment, the warnings hidden in plain sight. For nearly 2 years, the truth had existed inside those documents waiting for someone to assemble the pieces. And as the court prepared to reconvene, I realized we were approaching the moment when assumptions would finally be forced to compete with evidence. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt completely different. Earlier that morning, most people had arrived expecting a straightforward conclusion. Now every person in the room seemed aware that the outcome was no longer predictable. The judge returned to the bench carrying the recovered records along with several pages of notes. Attorneys settled into their seats. Court staff organized additional copies of the documents. Nobody appeared relaxed anymore. Not even Rebecca. I looked across the room and immediately noticed the difference. The confidence that had followed her for months was gone. She sat upright with her hands folded tightly in front of her. Daniel remained beside her, but his attention never seemed to settle in one place. He glanced toward the judge, then toward the documents, then toward his attorney. The pattern repeated again and again. The judge began by summarizing the significance of the recovered records. The explanation was calm and methodical. No accusations were made. No dramatic language was used. Yet every sentence seemed to weaken assumptions that had guided the case from the beginning. The recovered attachment confirmed that Thomas intentionally required additional verification before specific recommendations could be considered complete. The associated correspondence demonstrated that he viewed those verification steps as essential safeguards rather than optional formalities. Most importantly, the documents established that the review process had not reached the stage previously assumed by several parties. As the explanation continued, I saw Rebecca lower her eyes toward the table. The change was subtle, but impossible to miss. For the first time since this entire dispute began, she looked uncertain. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge referenced a handwritten notation attached to one of Thomas's memoranda. The notation was brief, only a few lines. Yet it directly addressed future decision-making authority if verification remained incomplete. The courtroom became completely silent while the passage was read into the record. Thomas had anticipated the possibility of assumptions being mistaken for conclusions. He had specifically instructed that unresolved reviews should remain unresolved until all supporting documentation had been independently confirmed. There it was, not hidden, not ambiguous, written in his own hand. Across the room, Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Rebecca stared at the documents without moving. Their attorney requested clarification regarding several points, but each answer led back to the same reality. The missing records were genuine. The review process had been incomplete. The assumptions built upon that incomplete process could no longer be treated as reliable. Months of certainty were collapsing under the weight of information that should have been available all along. I wish I could say I felt victorious. I did not. What I felt was something far more complicated. Relief, sadness, validation, disappointment. Rebecca was still my daughter. Watching her realize the situation had changed brought no satisfaction. Yet neither could I ignore what had happened. For months, she had pressured me to accept conclusions that Thomas himself had refused to finalize. The hearing continued for another hour as attorneys discussed procedural implications and future recommendations. By the time the judge concluded the session, one fact had become impossible to dispute. The story everyone believed at the beginning of the case was not the complete story. And as people slowly gathered their files and prepared to leave the courtroom, Rebecca finally looked up. Our eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The smile that had greeted me at the beginning of this journey was gone. In its place was the realization that evidence had done what arguments never could. It had forced the truth back into the conversation. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet after months of tension. Additional reviews were completed. Missing records were incorporated into the official file. Recommendations were revised. Assumptions were re-examined. The process moved forward exactly the way Thomas had always intended, carefully. One afternoon, nearly a month after the hearing, the final determination was issued. The outcome was not based on emotion. It was not based on sympathy. It was based on documentation. The court recognized that several conclusions had been reached before required verification had been completed. As a result, authority over key decisions remained where Thomas's records indicated it should remain until every safeguard had been satisfied. When I received the notice, I sat alone in the study and read it twice. Then I placed it beside the stack of letters that had changed everything. I thought I would feel triumphant. Instead, I felt grateful. Grateful that Thomas had documented his concerns so carefully. Grateful that Eleanor refused to stop asking questions. Grateful that facts eventually found their way into the conversation. A few days later, Rebecca called and asked if she could visit. The request surprised me. When she arrived, she looked different from the woman who had sat confidently inside that courtroom. Not defeated, simply tired. We sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where so many difficult conversations had taken place. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Rebecca finally broke the silence. She admitted that she had become so focused on solving immediate problems that she stopped questioning the assumptions behind her decisions. She acknowledged that Daniel's financial pressures had influenced more than either of them wanted to admit. Most importantly, she admitted that she had convinced herself speed was more important than verification. I listened quietly. The apology did not erase what happened. It did not erase the family gathering. It did not erase the pressure. It did not erase the months spent feeling as though my own judgment was being questioned. But it mattered, because for the first time in a very long while, I felt as though I was speaking with my daughter instead of an opponent. As the afternoon faded into evening, we talked about Thomas. Not the estate, not the hearings. Thomas. We remembered vacations, family traditions, stories that had nothing to do with legal records. Somewhere during that conversation, I realized what Thomas's true legacy had been all along. It was not the house. It was not the accounts. It was not any document stored inside a cabinet. His legacy was the principle that guided every note he left behind. Verify before you decide. Understand before you assume. Seek the truth even when it slows you down. Months later, the study remained exactly as it had always been. The letters stayed in their box. The records stayed on their shelves. Yet the room felt different now. Peaceful. Sometimes I would sit at Thomas's old desk and think about that first day in court. About the confidence. About the assumptions. About the forgotten records that nearly stayed forgotten forever. In the end, no dramatic secret changed our family. No hidden fortune appeared. Something far more important happened. The truth finally arrived. And once it did, everything else had no choice but to follow.